Good afternoon on Easter weekend. It's 50 degrees, it's overcast, and there's no wind, but it's comfortable for a walk, and I'm wearing comfortable clothing. I was listening to The Sorcerer's Apprentice. I think it's originally created by Dukas, D-U-K-A-S, I'm not sure. But it's a magnificent piece, because imagine that with the movement of a hand, you could have brooms clean up things, the magic. And wish that we could do that with some of our public issues these days. Why don't we start with Justice Thomas? Here's a man who doesn't bestride the centuries of our nation with the wisdom of difficult issues decided based on long-held tenets of legal precedent and statutes meant to cure problems, to make easier the life we have. No, he's a political hack. And there was a party leader in New York, Tammany party leader called Pickett. Is that right? But the quote I'm sure of him is, "I seize my opportunities and I takes them." Okay, that's our boy Thomas. He kept his mouth quiet for a long time, and those may have been his golden years, writing dissents. And he decided to come out and to ignore the law and to write things that he wanted and to disparage 50 years of thinking on one issue and more on others. And now he's come a cropper with his personal conduct, taking large amounts of money as gifts. That is to say, not cash, but, boondoggles out there. I think one was $500,000, and he's received these gifts and so forth, and he's just fine with it. And he said he talked to his colleagues. You got to wonder, who did he talk to? Kavanaugh? Maybe Alito? Because these guys, they don't understand the significance of being an authority on the law of the land, on the, what would you call it, the discipline that holds communities together, people together, gives direction to a nation. No, he's a radical autocrat, I think, which is ironic to be on the court and to not believe in the law. Now, when in the past, some very religious people in the court were asked about their belief system, there's a higher law, natural law. And you know what that is? It's something like Thomas Aquinas law. You just know it. You feel it. And you impose it, though it's not passed by a legislature. It doesn't come from hundreds of years of deciding questions going back to England. It's just what we want it to be. And they make up political theories about how they can change the law. For example, what would the original founders of our country do on this issue? Like what? Social media? How do you translate that between a period of time when we were uncovering science that involved things like kites and lightning? Pretty sophisticated engineering was going on, but nothing like what we deal with now. So, what is the latest? The latest is, what could you expect from a man like this in terms of his association with the wealthy, who take him on expensive trips that most people can only imagine, who receives all sorts of gifts and gives access to a man whose defense is, I don't have cases before the court, not the trial court or the other court. The access is what matters. The association with a man who has an agenda and who has the ear of a Supreme Court judge because he showers him with privilege and presence. It's terrible, but you know, Thomas More comes back to me. You know, he said to one person who was a petitioner to him, you know, can you get me on the court or do this or that? And he said, and what would you do? And he shows him a goblet that was given by a petitioner who had a case in the court where Sir Thomas More was holding court. And he said, would you be able to resist this? And decided on the merits. I think not. You know, and that's our problem with Thomas. And, you know, there's some people out saying, oh, you know, what is the precedent? How could you do anything? Well, I don't know. Some of you may remember Lyndon Johnson, and he had a favorite friend, a lawyer, Abe Fortas, whom he thought was helpful to him over the years. And he wanted to give him a place, a public service that would not just reward, but inform the court. And Abe Fortas was an extraordinary lawyer. And what he did, Johnson that is he convinced Justice Goldberg to step down and move to the UN, and then he could move Abe Fortas onto the court. He didn't want to wait or risk not being able to do that. And then after Fortas was there, then the Chief Justice position opened, and he tried to move him into that position, but he couldn't. And ultimately, Abe Fortas came a cropper. First of all, he was attacked on the Hill for having given a lecture series for $15,000. Nothing compared to our boy Thomas. And then there was another deal he had, and in this deal, he was going to get $20,000 a year for life from a guy, Lou Wolfson, I believe his name is. And Abe Fortas decided to resign. So Abe Fortas, a life in business and law, came a cropper on his old friends and decided that he should resign. So he was a man of character who realized the mistake he made and the propriety of how he conducted himself with other people. Well, he decided that he shouldn't be on the court. That's the kind of man he was. Well, Thomas is not that kind of man. Thomas is a man who takes, and that's what we have with him. So, there's a couple of other stories that interest me. Don't you find it hard to believe that someone wouldn't know the purpose of a parachute? So, for example, if you jump out of a plane, what should a parachute do? It should open. What if you're in the plane? Do you want the parachute to open, pull you out of the plane, knock you up against the wall of the inside of the plane, and perhaps kill you before you leave the plane? Well, this is not a fiction. This has really happened. And there is like the safety parachute that sits on your chest. It has defects, and if it catches certain winds, it opens and does what I've said. And some of our soldiers have died, not for any reason except for the fact that we can't design a parachute that's safe for them. There's talk that the servicemen and women, I assume, cannot recover because there's a law that doesn't permit them to recover, even when they're doing training exercises and dying because our government doesn't take good enough care for them. Now, there's a bill that's just waiting to happen. When you guys are not doing anything, why don't you pass that bill? Maybe Republicans could agree with that. I don't know. There's another peculiar thing in court. You're probably familiar by now with mifepristone, which is it's a drug. It's an abortion pill, is what it is. And there is something, half of all abortions are done with this pill. And we have two courts in the land. One, a trial court, federal trial court in Texas, a Trump appointee, and another in Washington State. And the one in Washington upheld the use of this. So there are 17 states affected by the judge in the state of Washington. And this is going to go chock-a-block up in the circuits and end up in the Supreme Court. One of the bases for a Supreme Court to take jurisdiction is if there are two circuits that have different holdings. Well, I'm not sure. I think we may have a split in the circuits, but we certainly have a split in the law, and that would make it a legitimate case to be heard by the Supreme Court. But consider, what business does a Texas judge have in saying that a drug is not safe or shouldn't be allowed because he's opposed to abortions? That's not our law. Now, not that I want to say on the same day we're also evoking the bad practices and personal animus and beliefs of Justice Thomas in this same regard. So are we going to have to elect people across the country? Are we going to have to strong arm people who don't follow the law off the bench? And how do they get on the bench? What did we say when they were up on the Hill? And they were saying, oh, don't worry, it's a precedent. I'll recognize the precedent. We have to wake up. We can't expect to be like the Sorcerer's Apprentice. It doesn't work that way. So we have that. Now, and then in Tennessee, the home of the KKK, we have this legislature throwing out two persons of color who are representing their people, and shouted or disrupted a proceeding of the state legislature. Well, that's you don't throw people out for that reason. In the worst case, if they had had a real notice of charge and that had a real trial instead of an outcome-determined proceeding to allow them to get this, throw out the two men who are black, but not the woman who is white, who commented herself on the fact that, an older white woman doesn't get thrown out, but the two black representatives do. Outrageous. Well, I think both of these men are going to find themselves back in the chambers. And in the meantime, by being so transparently wrong about how they treated these two members, they make our case. And I'm glad to see that the White House is commenting, that the Vice President has been down there. This is what we need. We cannot remain silent when these things are going on. So, those of you who celebrate and worship on Easter Sunday, I respect your right to do so. I will not be doing that. And those who had Passover after the fact, I hope you had an enjoyable feast day. And I think it is a time of rebirth, like the symbols. The most visible symbol that we see is, a bunny or eggs, because that reflects the old thinking of what these holidays were about, recognizing the season of rebirth. And our nation needs a rebirth. And there are two trends right now, and one leads to destruction and violence and lawlessness, and it is those who believe dictators are just fine, and that's not acceptable. Autocrats are not acceptable. The other, we've taken a step finally to actually arresting a former president who's a one-man crime wave. That's a good start. But what are we going to do about Thomas? Shouldn't there be an investigation? We can't expect him to resign. The chief judge doesn't seem to have any way to deal with him. He must have filed some documents that represent false statements. Why not think about that? What the hell are we doing with our armed services that we have parachutes that don't work? It's not funny. It's hysteria that we have to even deal with a question like that. That should come up in a poem or short story as a metaphor for something else, but in fact it's true. How is it that we have narrowed our sights to hurt women in magnificent and horrible and torturous ways? Not just the pill, everything that has to do with what was Roe v. Wade. What about how we treat our children? Look at what's going on in Tennessee. They don't give a damn about the safety of the children. They talk about them being the promise, you know. They'd be glad to show us some kid with an AR-15 shooting at a target, but they don't want to do anything about the guns that are manufactured by Smith & Wesson in Tennessee. So, that's our problem. And we the people have to do something about it. And it doesn't have to be more than phone calls or notes. The mass of... how would I say, the math of individuals massed together saying this won't stand is the only thing politicians understand. But it has to be clear, it has to be persistent. It doesn't have to be by one person. Everyone can do it, just like the people are demonstrating in Tennessee now and are fighting in the courts. That's what we need, because otherwise we're going to find our democracy hijacked by these dictators, and that's not acceptable. So, I say Happy Easter from my Cathedral of Trees, and I'll probably see you tomorrow. Have a good Easter Sunday. All the best. Bye-bye.